Hello, and welcome to Everything is Ideology, a cultural studies podcast. I'm Dr. Lee Kaplan, and in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Sarah Balakrishnan, a Canadian Indian writer and historian based in the Department of History at Duke University. In our conversation, we discuss her wonderful essay, Colonizing Accra, Experiments in Storytelling. In our conversation, we discuss aspects of how she approaches the colonial archive, not simply as a record of imperial power, but as something more textured, layered, and contested, something woven like a cloth. We talk about what it means to read stories from within the archive, how narrative can make abstract structures like colonialism concrete and lived, and why history from below can reveal a very different account of when and how colonial rule was actually experienced on the ground. We also explore the relationship between storytelling and historical method, the role of contingency in the making of history, and the challenge of recovering voices and events that dominant historical canons have obscured. Along the way, Balakrishnan reflects on writing as both a historian and a fiction writer, on the influence of narrative form in her scholarship, and on the possibilities and limits of the archive itself. If you like what we do here, make sure to subscribe and support us on Patreon, where you'll have access to all of our episodes. Sarah Balakrishnan is a Canadian Indian writer and scholar based in the Department of History at Duke University. Balakrishnan is the 2022 Narrative Prize winner, the winner of Narrative Magazine's Best Under 30 Writing Contest, and a finalist for the Cecilia Joyce Johnson Award for Short Fiction from the Key West Literary Seminar. Since 2020, Balakrishnan has served as a fiction editor at the Maple Tree Literary Supplement. Her fiction writing has been supported by grants from the Craigardan, Hedgebrook, and American Short Fiction. Balakrishnan received a PhD in history from Harvard University in 2020 and a BA in History and Political Theory from McGill University in 2014. She was a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge, a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute, and at the University of Virginia, and a postdoctoral fellow in the History Department at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Balakrishnan's scholarly research has appeared in a number of prestigious venues, including the Journal of African History, the Journal of Social History, and Comparative Studies in Society and History. So welcome so much, Doctor. Thanks for joining us. So, I guess there were different ways I sort of wanted to open up, and I think everything's going to weave together, and it's funny maybe saying weave or sort of texture just because you invoke the sort of metaphor of kente cloth in the piece itself, and discuss kind of the colonial archives as a sort of kente cloth, which is an interesting reading of the colonial archives because people generally see them as a source of power that goes one way and not the other. So I really thought this was very cool because you're reading against the sort of archive in the archive, but also you have a different sort of methodological approach to the archive as well. So I guess before we get into the sort of historicity of what's being discussed, unless you want to invoke it, which is Accra, Ghana, specifically the colonial sort of periods and whatnot. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind saying something about sort of how you approach this piece as a sort of fiction writer, nonfiction writer, and also wearing your sort of like historian post-colonial hat, or just colonial.
Wow, yeah, thanks for that big question to start. Well, I think that one of my ambitions always when I was doing my doctoral work, doing my archival work, was really to try to kind of conceptualize what colonialism looks like on the ground. I just really, as a Canadian student based in the United States, I just really didn't have a conception beyond the sort of narrative of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, like what does colonization look like? And at least when things fall apart, there's this village that's supposedly pretty untouched by European presence for a very long time. Then, a white man comes in, there are missionaries, and things fall apart very quickly. But I sort of thought, what if you were a person like in a city like Accra, where white people have been living for centuries? I mean, the first European traders, the Portuguese, arrive in southern Ghana in 1471 in Elmina. They're trading in Accra by the early 1500s. By the time the colonial state arrives, in theory, in the 1870s, I mean, there's been 370 years of European white traders living in a city. So what does it mean to suddenly be colonized after having been a part of the European kind of Atlantic influence for so many years? So that was really the question I started out with. And what I really was looking for was stories. I wanted to know what it looked like on the ground, because as a student of history, we're taught, well, the colonial state passes this law and this law and this law, and therefore the state emerges at this time. Europeans can kind of just say, well, I declare the Gold Coast to be my colony, ergo now colonialism has begun. But it wasn't clear to me that just because a law is passed or a proclamation is made in London, it wasn't clear to me that that translates to any kind of meaningful difference to people who are living in Accra at the time and who are used to European presence, who are used to foreign traders, used to negotiating with white people while still retaining their sovereignty. So I set out quite deliberately to find stories of what colonization looked like. And the piece that I wrote, this essay, Colonizing Accra, was basically stitching together a series of stories to make the argument that when we look at the history of colonialism from below, and from below meaning from the perspective of people who are living on the ground, people who are not Europeans, we actually see a very different story of colonization emerge. It's different because it's happening actually many years later than what historians would describe. We date colonization to the moment that the English sort of say, this is a colony in 1873. But it really isn't until the mid to late 1880s that people in Accra start to actually kind of suffer the consequences of what colonialism means and start to realize that the contours of their government has sort of fundamentally changed, and that their rights as people, or the respect that they're given as citizens of this city, are changing and are no longer respected, and their lives aren't respected. And so that really was the ambition of the piece, was sort of to stitch together several stories of how that happens. And I have one story that focuses on the beating of this Accra man named George Bruce. He's just walking home with a woman one night, and a colonial officer beats him within an inch of his life. And this ends up sparking these huge kind of race riots around the meanings of colonialism in 1886. Then I look at the destruction of this important sacred rock that had been worshipped as a god named Tumote off the coast of Accra, and how the colonial state, after a very long time, decides to use it as quarry stone. And then I look at the trial that took place following a large British massacre in this little kind of eastern village called Taviefe, where afterwards the British tried the Taviefe chiefs for murder, and the Accra jury exonerated them. And then for a moment, trial by jury is suspended in Accra. All these terrible things unfurl. And so I sort of take this this kind of panoptic look at all the different stories that are starting to emerge at this time, that the moral of those stories is that power is different now. The relationship with white Europeans is different now. Like, things have changed for the worse. And this, to me, is the onset of a different colonization.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you already sort of preemptively kind of got to the story bit that I'd love to discuss more. I thought the stories were incredibly captivating, and that's perhaps probably why this was sort of more moving. And you sort of also, I guess we might get to it now or later, but the ways in which you sort of invoke Fanon were really interesting to me, because generally speaking, colonialism is this overarching abstract concept that we see happening, but you're like, no, there's no sort of singular notion of colonialism. It's a process that happens in different ways, in different places, depending on social and material conditions and whatnot. And that was something I really appreciated you digging out of the piece, because you were saying that's also the power of narrative, is to sort of make something abstract, concrete, and sort of real through a sort of like lived experience. And you mentioned when you were talking about history from below, of course, like invoking a sort of Marcus Rediker kind of thing. And I found this ringing true sort of like throughout. You quote Rediker saying, "All good storytellers tell a big story within a little story, and so do good historians." So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this big story within the little story, and how this concept or sort of notion of stories works within creating the piece. And this is the last part. You also managed to talk about sort of your own stance towards writing in sort of auto-reflexive way in your writing. So I was wondering like how you managed to weave, it seems like, three things together. Like, you put yourself in there, you put sort of like the stories in there and you put some archival theory in there. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is another really great question. Um, I think, again, like what you just said, for me, I always was very drawn to narrative history.
Yeah.
I've always been drawn to stories in the way that I think most people innately are. We love a good story. We love a good story, whether it's on TV or in books. One of the reasons we like history is because we're fascinated by the story of how we all got to where we are today, what moments or processes or events made our society the way it is. And so for me, I was always drawn to stories, but I think pretty quickly I learned that they were doing something more than just telling us information about the past in a more evocative way. For me, the point of the story was that it always exposed the kind of human level contingency of everything that was happening.
Yeah.
When you really got to know the personalities of the people involved, their relationships, the fragilities and tensions that are inherent within those relationships, you start to marvel that anything happens exactly the way it did. It feels like once you really get to know the humans involved, you're talking about rows and rows and rows of dominoes. And if even one of those had come down, everything today would be different. And that always to me resonated then very discordantly with the theorists like Fanon, who will say something like, the colonist makes history and he knows it. I sort of thought, to write in such an absolutist way that the colonial state has all the power, the people have no power, the colonial state authors history, you know, colonized people must collectively struggle in order to have any bearing on history at all. It just didn't resonate at all with the story of what was actually happening on the ground. And of course, I mean, part of that acknowledgement is that colonial processes look differently in different territories. Again, when we have this kind of totalizing theory about what colonialism is, we assume, yeah, everywhere in the world, states had all this power, except everywhere in the world, different norms, different legal norms existed. And those legal norms were often struck not because some colonial states were more caring than others, but because indigenous people had sort of crafted a situation and asserted themselves in a way that allowed for them to have more legal freedoms. And in colonial Ghana, I mean, the people had a lot of legal freedom. When the Taviefe chiefs are exonerated for murder, it's by a Ghanaian jury who, by the 18th century, I mean, there were enough educated Ghanaians that they were barristers, they were judges, they were jurors. I mean, they really are, to a large extent, controlling the colonial process. And so, to me, I think I just became fascinated with this idea that stories could tell us something more than just an evocative way of presenting the same information, but really expose the human level contingency of everything that is happening as it unfolds, so that we as readers or as students don't just ascribe total agency or authority to the colonist. And then, so those are like the two levels, I guess, in this question. There's why the story and what stories are being told. And then there's the third level, which is me. I obviously infused a lot of myself in the piece. And I think part of that is the acknowledgement that when one really decides to tell the story, and that story that you're telling is a true one, it's not fiction that you've created, it is your best interpretation of what actually happened more than a century ago. You owe it a little bit to your reader to explain how you got there and why you're doing it the way you're doing it. And so this was sort of my entry point. I've never written anything else in which I have had like a presence in the text. Of course, it's very normal for anthropologists to position themselves in relation to their subjects in theory, because historians, most of their subjects, certainly my subjects, are long past. I mean, we're talking about people who lived in the 19th century. One doesn't usually have to do that. But here, because I was attempting to do something very different, I felt the need to sort of explain how I had arrived at the conclusion that narrative history has to come back into vogue. It's almost been eschewed within the academy to tell stories instead of looking for the kind of structural algorithms that explain how history happened. And here it was sort of saying, the story actually can show us those same things too. And it can show us something that speaking algorithmically does not.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of amazing that throughout this entire piece, you're able to invoke all of those various different stories in a way that's quite digestible and also easy to read and to sort of understand and whatnot. Shout out for needing something kind of accessible for various undergrad classes. Highly recommend this piece. So, and yeah, it's true. Like, as you sort of get into various types of colonialism in different places and stages, like, obviously, what comes to mind is like sort of thinking of like Palestine. There's so many different sort of like stages and layers. And even right now, we're looking at the sort of same situation, that it's a continually changing thing. And some scholars talk about the sort of like situation in Palestine being like pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, like all three at the same time, which makes for a particularly difficult and enlightening sort of study into power dynamics and whatnot. Um, One thing, this isn't so much a question, but just like something that I struck me. One thing that was kind of interesting, and I don't know, you don't really even have to say much about this, but sort of, I was thinking of critical fabulation, the sort of Saidiya Hartman thing throughout the entire time. I know it's not like quite sort of the thing to be like, well, why didn't you invoke this person? But that was on my mind. This is a sort of outside of the text question, so forgive.
Actually, it's amazing you asked that because absolutely she was on my mind. Actually, I wrote several drafts of this essay before the version that came to be printed. With any piece that passes through the American Historical Review, there's a lot of revisions involved. Most people I know revised it 4 times or 5 times, something crazy. And this piece was no different. I think I revised it 4 or 5 times. And it was a very, very different essay at the beginning. It still told the same 3 stories, and it still made the same arguments, but it was written in academic language. And, I went back and forth with the editor, Emily Kalachi, and it just became clear to me at a certain point that like everything I was saying was fine and the stories were good, but there was something about the way I was writing it that wasn't working. And I found myself opening up Wayward Lives by Saidiya Hartman, and I read the introduction, and then there was something about the language that really transported me. And even though, I mean, there's no critical fabulation in the introduction, she's just a beautiful writer. I mean, she worked very hard to be a beautiful writer. She is a beautiful writer. And I read that introduction, and as if I was transported, wrote the new introduction to the essay. And before, the essay started with this kind of very theoretical introduction and then went into the beating of George Bruce. And instead, I started the essay with the beating of George Bruce, and then I weaved back to Marcus Rediker. And then I told in this more fragmented way, which follows the way that she told the introduction to Wayward Lives. So in fact, it's directly influenced by Saidiya Hartman, and influenced by her writing more than it is her invocation of critical fabulation. Because the thing that I take from critical fabulation is rather than a move to kind of imagine what the archive does not give us, which I think is how a lot of people interpret it, it is more like a direct, confrontational, and very visible grappling with what the archive does not tell us. So, not a move to fill in gaps, but a move to acknowledge and dwell upon the gaps that exist. And I think that what I've found that has been the mark of my work is that, in fact, there is so much that the archives tell us that we just haven't noticed. And of course, we're working in different archives, and she's working in the archives of enslaved people who were not documented nearly as well as we would want. And I work on the archives of colonized people that simply did procure more documentation, at least about their individual personalities and lives, than is often afforded us in her circumstances. But I've always been shocked by the level of documents we have about people living in the 19th century, people in the early colonial Ghanaian state, people like that feature in my book, like in Edmund Bannerman, who's a wonderful character, Alexander Bruce. I mean, we just know a remarkable amount about these people, and they are full-fledged sort of characters in my mind. So yeah, I lean very heavily on Saidiya Hartman, but I didn't feel the impulse towards critical fabulation because I think rather than dwelling on silences, I've always been amazed by the superabundance of information that we have, and that in some ways historians just have not either noticed or spent as much time with because it doesn't fit the mold of what we think colonialism looks like at a particular moment in time.
Yeah, totally. And I'm glad I asked that question then. I felt like, I don't know if I should sort of ask. But, um, it also seems to me it depends on kind of the archive in which you're looking through and going through. So you also mentioned in your piece that like because they sort of didn't know what to do with these various sort of uprisings and whatnot, they kind of documented it all in different ways. So there's different sort of levels of documentation that happens. Like Sadia Hartman's subject, like Venus, the famous one, right, is sort of looking at like a slave, right? Like a black female slave specifically. And she's given sort of no stories, no interiority. Like, it's quite violent and quite depressing, which is kind of the point in many different ways, but also not the point in also many ways, right? Um, so there seems to be something specific happening with colonial archives that enslavement sort of archives don't do and look at. Which brings me to this question that I had when I was reading it, which is sort of within the archive, what materials were you looking at and working with? Were these diary accounts? I know there's a lot of newspaper accounts that you mentioned, um, but sort of like what kind of were the materials you used to construct this stories, or rather, these stories were already constructed. You just wrote them down or something like.
Yeah, so where I found my best evidence, and this is really where like the majority of my like book and dissertation were written from, is these series of files that in the Ghanaian archives are called the Secretary of Native Affairs files. And these are basically in the colonial state, there was one guy known as the Secretary for Native Affairs. And he was the point person when anything happened with the so-called natives, so indigenous people in Ghana. If there was a riot, if people destooled their ruler, as in deposed him, if there was some sort of protest, and people could write to the they could write to the Secretary of Native Affairs anytime they wanted protests and grievances. And so it was kind of like a catch-all series of papers about Indigenous life. Anything that really didn't fit into a specific department went to the Secretary of Native Affairs as long as it was an Indigenous problem. And usually the Secretary for Native Affairs files are sorted geographically and not chronologically, which makes them actually very, very hard to use, very hard to find anything, if you were writing, say, just a simple kind of urban history, you're like writing the history of Sekondi or the history of Accra, you might open up all the boxes that are labeled Accra, and that's manageable. For me, I was writing a dissertation that was about all of southern Ghana during the entire colonial period. Actually, my book begins in the 1470s with the arrival of the Portuguese, and it doesn't conclude until 1957 with the fall of the British colonial state. So it's a 500-year period over the entire geographic expanse. So it was a daunting task. But at the same time, it was where the information was best because almost all of these miscellaneous documents inside these boxes were either letters written by African people, sometimes having hired local stenographers to write it, but letters by African people, or the Secretary for Native Affairs had come himself and was mediating a dispute, and there were transcripts of what everybody said. And it was just the best place to find African voices. So where I found the story about George Bruce was in a Secretary of Native Affairs folder that was called something like Accra Police Riot or something like that. And it was in the Accra box. And I opened it up and I read this story about George Bruce, and it was so compelling and it was hard to read. I mean, this is like 19th century handwriting on kind of moldy yellow parchment documents that are not in any kind of plastic sleeve, that have been weathering all of the the storms since they were crafted in 1886. I'm reading it 140 years later. It was hard to read, but the story was so compelling that I just kept going. And then I thought, well, this isn't, I didn't even know what it was yet. This was one of my first weeks in the archive. I just took down the whole thing and was like, wow, this Black man was beaten for no reason. And there were riots that follow. And I didn't yet know the political context. I didn't know anything about his family. I didn't know that they were starting this kind of massive campaign against the colonial state. I didn't know they planned to send a deputation to London to appeal to Queen Victoria herself. I didn't know any of that yet. But I knew this story was meaningful. The story about the Taviefe rock I found while I was in the National Archives of the United Kingdom in London. And that's a very different set of archives. Basically, when the colonial state felt like London should know about something that was happening, they would write a series of dispatches to London, and those would end up in the British National Archives. And I used to say, kind of colloquially, that every day spent in London, I would get 4 times as much done in Ghana, just because the amount of information from Indigenous people was so high in Ghana compared to London. Like, you'd have to be fine with sifting through a whole week for about one day's worth of evidence in Ghana. But I came across that story, and even though it was written in like total British legalese, it's about acquiring this rock, like you could see the story beneath it, that people had been campaigning to save this rock for decades, that this rock had spiritual meaning. And then, going back into my pre-colonial archives, looking at letters from British traders, Danish traders, Dutch traders, French traders, dating back centuries, you could see how spiritually important this rock had been. Because for centuries, Europeans have been saying there is a god off the coast of Accra. It is the same as Tumote. No European is allowed to trespass there. This is an important deity. I mean, it's marked out on European maps from an early stage as a rock not to land on. Even though it was just such a small window inside the archives in London into this life world, it felt so significant to me. So that became the second story. And then the third story, the Taviefe massacre, I mean, less so the trial than the massacre, was a really weird story. I basically was reading, I read it, I was in London and I read this letter from the Aborigines Protection Society, which was this kind of organization that exists in London advocating for the rights and protections of Indigenous people inside the colonies. They wrote this letter to the colonial governor in 1896 saying, by the way, we haven't forgot about the Taviefe massacre where you massacred 800 to 1,000 innocent civilians. And I read that and I thought, well, that sounds crazy. Like, I've read most history books of Ghana and no one has ever mentioned a massacre of 800 to 1,000 people. And I looked it up and I couldn't find anything about it. And I tried to find Taviefe on a map of Ghana, but like in the colonial lexicon, most names are spelled in different ways or misspelled over time. And I just couldn't even find this place. I didn't even know if it existed. So at some point I thought, probably can't be in Ghana. Like, that's just some other thing that happened in some other colony. And then about 6 months later, I was in Accra and I was in the Accra archives. And in the Accra archives, there's a very small reading room and you can see what's stacked on everybody's desk. People just have big folders or boxes sitting on their desks. And I was in the reading room and there was a folder sitting on someone's desk and it said Taviefe 1888. And I thought, and I actually recognized it. I thought, hey, isn't that place where that massacre was supposed to have occurred? And wasn't that in 1888? And I really thought about it and I thought, well, that's weird. And I actually moved on. I just continued to do my work, thought nothing of it. And then later, like another 6 months had passed, or maybe a year had passed, and I was back in London. I was sitting in the British Library, and I was reading old colonial newspapers on microfilm. And I got to this volume of the Western Echo, set in 1888, and suddenly all of the coverage was about this massacre. And it was just this moment where I really like put down my pen and thought, my God, like this really happened. There was a massacre of 800 to 1,000 people, and we don't know anything about it. And it definitely happened in Ghana. And I know where I can find all the evidence because I've actually been passing it by for like a year now. I've been like intentionally not looking for it. And so I took down all the newspaper coverage about the event, and then I went back to Accra and I ordered up the folder called Taviefe 1888 because I knew it existed. And so then I had that, and then I went through the entire folder, and then I knew that there was a trial because I had mentioned a trial. And so then I knew where the trial transcript would be because the Supreme Court records are also kept in the Accra archives. So then I called up the Supreme Court records, and they were in very terrible condition. I'm sure nobody will ever read it after me. But I read the whole trial transcript, and then I found out that there was another folder that contained the jurors and because the jurors at this time are allowed to ask questions like lawyers. Right now, juries are silent. But back in the time, jurors could ask questions. So I called up the next volume of the Supreme Court records that had all the information on the jurors. And then I basically fell to my knees when I saw Alexander Bruce and Edmund Bannerman were jurors, because I knew them both so well and they had appeared in the George Bruce assault. And then I knew that Edmund Bannerman had later become the Taviefe people's lawyer and sued the colonial state over the return of the Taviefe chiefs. So it was an amazing, that's how it happened, was it all happened very gradually. But by the end, when I got to the trial, I knew, because I knew the archives very well, exactly where I was going to find every piece of information. And the only thing that I never found, which I was so sad about, was that I know that 2 months after the trial, the Accra jury reunited to write a letter to the colonial state explaining why trial by jury should not be abolished in Accra, and to explain why their finding of not guilty was a legally sound finding. And I knew that that letter existed because it had been referenced several times, but I never found the letter. And even though one can imagine what that letter said, it's easy to connect the dots, and it's easy to imagine that Edmund Bannerman wrote it. Just to not have that letter, it drove me crazy. I mean, I really ransacked the Accra archive looking for that letter, and I never found it.
Well, I hope you find it soon. We'll speak it into existence. I think we just did. That was an amazing story. I mean, the recap, the different areas. It definitely speaks to different sort of knowledge centers and power that's happening. Specifically, like the weird ways in which private property and like a burgeoning sort of sense of private property was being used to sort of justify in many different ways these colonial onslaughts. I know the massacre that you sort of mentioned, the jury's defense was brilliant, where they talk about sort of it not taking place on the right sort of territory. Did they hoist up a German flag? And then also specifically your story with the rock made me think of, alternative cartographies and the ways sort of like earth and material are used for different sort of purposes and whatnot, right? There's very clearly a different relationship with the land happening. Specifically in Ghana with the rock and the sort of foundational myth story. And I thought that was such a stark contrast between one utilizing the sort of material that's considered a god and breaking it up to then use it as quarry to develop various buildings and whatnot was, you could kind of see how these developments within the sort of attitudes toward the colonizer by the colonized like develop and change, because at first there seemed to be sort of this hope that you can kind of discuss matters like, oh, the queen is quite rational, that's like their thing, like this is the enlightenment and everyone's rational, but it turns out that you're ignored, or you are sort of like these kangaroo courts that exist. And I know you also sort of mentioned like representation that's happening. I thought everything we're thinking through now and seeing with just like false identity politics and all these various sort of things we see today. And I thought this was, well, this is like 200 years ago, but very much also the underlying logics are still occurring. I wanted to ask, I guess, unless you want to have a sort of follow up with that, but I wanted to ask kind of, you mentioned temporality happening, and I thought what was really interesting with your answer was the ways in which stories are pieced together. It's never like this, this, this. It's like this, oh my God, what's over here? Let's look over here. Let's open up a new tab, kind of thing. So you wrote that, this is a quote from you, it is not necessarily the case that in the archive, events will appear out of order, but in this case, with 19th century files in Accra. But this is the case, rather, sorry. So would you mind talking about sort of like temporality and sort of finding stuff in the archive and how like linearity might be challenged and whatnot within this case?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always imagined history like a sequence. I mean, and that's, I think, also how we teach it in schools, that like one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. And often in that kind of case, we can appreciate contingency. We can appreciate that if X hadn't happened, Y wouldn't have happened. But especially depending on the archive that you're in, it's just not the impression you will get. So if you're in London, the colonial files on the Gold Coast are usually in a folder called CO96, Gold Coast Dispatches. And those are in linear order. You just get volume after volume after volume. And it's every letter that any colonial officer in Ghana has ever written to London to be like, by the way, I'm informing you of this. And you can get a linear story, and that's what I was working with. But then you go to Ghana, and when things are sorted by geography instead of date, it is a totally different situation. So you're like, maybe I'll open up this box. Seshi. I don't know what's going on in Seshi. Let's find out. And it was like a patchwork quilt. I was just every day opening up a box and being like, oh, and this is happening over here, and this is happening over here, and this is happening over here. And I was suddenly extending. It was like I was broadening the lens of the story being told to see all these other things happening in all these places. And when I broadened that lens, it changed the story itself. It changed the story of what colonialism looked like and when it happened and how it happened and the sequence that I had sort of taken for granted. You know, if you're sitting in London and you're reading the colonial Secretary of State for the colonies write to the governor being like, by the way, we have passed a proclamation saying this is now a colony and you now have the powers of blah, blah, blah. Please hire these many people, yours sincerely. You're like, wow, colonization has happened. But then when you're looking from below and you're looking at these villages and these towns and you're opening up boxes of just people's voices and what's happening at the time, you just realize how many, you know, I think about that statement, you know, we all contain multiples. I'm like, well, imagine if we're talking about 300,000 people dispersed across different villages and cities and so many things are going on at once. This is the story, right? There is drama everywhere and many different kinds of drama. And I just became fascinated with that. You know, the thing that used to give me the most joy, and I'm going to do it again this summer, is just going back to the Accra archives and just opening up villages and town boxes that I haven't looked at yet, because you're always going to find something really interesting. Something crazy is going to be going on somewhere. And I think the thing that I have learned more than anything else in kind of this process of looking for stories and looking from below is that we don't know the canon, the chronology as well as we think we do. You know, the weirdest part about the Taviefe massacre to me was that none of the evidence was hidden and historians just didn't know about it. And there's kind of, you know, I would say in the number of historians working on different African countries, I think there are more historians working on South Africa than Ghana. Maybe there's a few more working on Nigeria than Ghana, but Ghana's got to be in the top 3. There are a lot of historians working on Ghana, and for various structural reasons. The fact that we didn't know about this giant massacre that occurred at the dawn of colonial rule was so surprising to me, and it felt like the kind of surprise that had to arrive as a consequence of the colonial state hiding evidence, but they hadn't. They hadn't hidden evidence. It's just that when we look at evidence, we don't see stories that we don't expect to see. It's hard to find a massacre you're not looking for. I bypassed it like 3 times, you know? I saw a letter that claimed there was a massacre and thought, well, probably didn't happen in Ghana. And then I saw a folder in the Accra archives that said Taviefe 1888. And even then I thought, oh yeah, where that massacre in theory took place. Like, it took a really long time for me to come around to the idea that it had happened, because we just accept that we already know the major chronology. If there was a really big event, we're going to know about it. And I think what I've learned is that that is an arrogant vantage. And part of the arrogance is that we cannot know what's happening in every place at every time. And when we look at, it's hard to find stories you're not looking for. And so I feel like I've spent the beginning of my career literally just looking for stories that no one knew existed, by virtue of being very open to anything being possible. And that's sort of the story of this essay, is 3 stories no one has heard of that I think most people would have thought probably never happened, because we don't know to look for things that are not in the kind of official chronology of the colonial state.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that's something you laid out too, what's in sort of like archival theory and whatnot. Like, if you have a particular idea and a framework, it sort of discounts or preempts certain forms of knowledge production. And it seems like that's also like what you're getting at when you talk about like hated white and stuff like this. Like, stories are just deep structures, man. Like, that's it, right? And stories are such a great way of sort of learning, of passing on things, and just sort of to have that sort of attitude towards stories really obviously speaks to like it not too great because it's sort of like, okay, we have this sort of deep structuralist attitude, right? But how did we miss this, right? We use these sort of frameworks, but look at what we missed, right? So there's something kind of problematic with that, right? So if our tools and our modes of analysis are leading up to these like Lucani, it's like, okay, well, like, what's they're still worth things, but it's sort of like, what are we missing as a result of them? And what you're sort of what you just said brought to mind is there are different forms of canon. So there's canon for the colonized, canon for the colonizer, right? And what you sort of like unlock or something in different ways is this various like history is sort of never fixed and never just one thing. Like it's very clearly not even history is written by the victors. It's like some things are picked up in different ways for weird reasons or different reasons or something like this. So I was wondering if you could talk about like this is again, maybe a meta historiography question, but the sort of problems with canonization, because it seems to be like, okay, you're suggesting very correctly that there are two canons. So would you mind saying something maybe about that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think so. I do think there are two canons. I think there is the history of events that matter to the people who are colonized, and then there is the history of the events that matter to the colonizer. And the history of the events that matter to the colonizer are almost always just laws and perhaps major uprisings. And for the colonized, it's always different. It's always those moments of rupture where they realize that the norms of governance have changed and that they are in trouble in new ways or there are new possibilities. But all that being said, I think one of the things I found either most mystifying or most disheartening is how much that second canon disappears over time. Because if colonized people cannot write and they're not writing their own histories, eventually they start to appropriate the history written by the colonizer. So I think anyone living in Accra in maybe the 1910s probably heard about the breaking up of Tumote Rock. I know this because I.B. Corti Papafio, a colonial era anthropologist, writes about Tumote Rock very eloquently 20 years after it's been blown up. He knows about its significance. I mean, it was transmitted orally for sure. But by the time we get to now, people don't remember these events, or they remember them in very odd ways. Like one of the weirdest experiences I've had was going back to Taviefe and doing oral histories with people living in Taviefe about the Taviefe massacre. And people knew about the event. That was not something that had been forgotten, but they had really appropriated the colonial state's memory of the event. They were like, we deserved it. We were committing very barbaric acts at that time period. We used to beat babies with mortars and pestles. And they told me these stories, and I sort of said, I know that a colonial historian, William Walton Claridge, wrote a book that says those things. And he wrote that, 40 years after the massacre. But I've never seen any documents from the time that supports that allegation. In my view, based on the documents from the time, it appears that there was a white colonial officer, John Scott Dalrymple, who came to deliver a message to Taviefe and arrested the leaders, which he wasn't actually authorized to do, and said he was going to march them to another settlement called Peki. And then in retribution, the Taviefe villagers did kill him. And that was why the colonial state unleashed this massacre. But it was nothing to do with the barbaric acts of murdering children and beating them and so on. And they were said, no, we have a local historian who wrote a history of this massacre, and we can show you. And I was like, well, if you have a local historian who wrote an account of this massacre, then absolutely I would want to see it. And so there was some back and forth on how I was going to get my hands on it, whether they were going to show me the original. And then just as I was supposed to leave and had sort of finally given up on the idea that I was ever going to get a copy of this, a man met me on motorcycle right as my bus was about to leave and handed me a photocopy of the chapter of this local history about the Taviefe massacre. And it was literally an excerpt of William Walton Claridge's book, except that the cover said W.W. Clarke. So like the last name had been changed to being a Ghanaian last name, but it was the exact same text. And it looked legit. I mean, the cover looked legitimate, like everything about it, but it was immediately, I immediately recognized the text as being by William Walton Claridge. And I just had this crazy moment where I was like, this book that was written by this white colonial officer 100 years ago has been indigenized as being a local history by like an Ewe speaking historian, and it's not. And I talked to my advisor about it, and he told me that there's a well-known term in oral history called feedback, where text starts to feed into oral memory. So you're talking and you're trying to capture oral memory, but in fact, it's been deeply informed by texts that have pre-circulated and that have changed social memory. And so this was a classic example of feedback, that the text had changed local memories. And so I think that the sad thing is that even though at the time there will always be sort of two different kind of canonical interpretations between what the state thinks and what people think, if people cannot write or record their own histories, those do become collapsed onto the state's narrative. And that is part of what makes it harder to resurrect that other canon, is that even people who are kind of these gatekeepers of oral memory are going to repeat to you the state's ideology. And it's hard to see around it. It's hard to see around this one narrative that seems to be coming from both sides. So that's something I think a lot about.
That's remarkable. All the various stories you've kind of shared are really kind of like mind-boggling in many different ways. Yeah, it makes me think of sort of like politics of memory stuff, and then also like the double consciousness aspect of things and whatnot. But I know you have to go.
I do,
Okay.
unfortunately.
So, no, thank you. I want to be respectful of your time. So is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye?
No, I really wanted to thank you. This was such a fun experience. I really enjoyed myself.
Oh, yeah, this was wonderful. I'm really happy to share these kind of moments with you. And thanks so much for putting this piece together. It was a great read.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
thank you so much for reading it. I really appreciate it.
of course. I'll share it with some folks. Obviously, on here, they
Okay.
count as the folks, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much and best of luck with everything.
All right. Thanks so much, Lee.